To give us more perspective in terms of what is happening in Russia now, we're joined in by our correspondent Julia Chapman, who's joining us live from Moscow. Julia, bring us up to speed in terms of what is happening in Russia in terms of the COVID-19 infections there.
Well, today, Moscow will begin its full lockdown for the very first time. There have been a number of gradual measures introduced in the capital, but as of today, Monday, the entire city has effectively been shut down, and residents have been told they are no longer allowed to leave their homes. Apart from a handful of exceptions, they're allowed to go to the nearest grocery store to pick up provisions. They can go seek medical help. They can walk a dog, but not very far from their home, and they can take out the garbage. And in many ways, this is a stricter lockdown than we've seen in other European cities like London and Paris, because Muscovites are being told they cannot even leave their homes to go for a walk or a short run. So they are effectively left inside for the foreseeable future. So far, the Moscow authorities say this will only go on for a week. And this came after President Putin last week announced a nationwide holiday for the entire country to stop working for a week in order to stop people from travelling to work and infecting one another, perhaps in their workplaces. But that was later clarified by the Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin, who said that if people could still work from home, they should continue to do so. And this was not a holiday in the traditional sense. But nevertheless, a number of Russians did fly south to Sochi, the resort city on the Black Sea, at which point they were told they could not check into hotels, they could not visit national parks, and more strict restrictions were brought into place there as well. So now people in Moscow are being told to stay home. That is not applicable to the rest of the country yet, but it is certainly in Moscow where we've seen the highest number of cases, which exceeded 1,000 over the weekend, and the national total is just over 1,500 now.
Absolutely indeed, and also considering the proximity of Russia and China, which shares a border of almost over 2,000 kilometers, and the fact as to how badly the COVID-19 infections have infected the rest of Europe. You know, what perhaps is the reason as to why there are so few cases of infections that have been reported within Moscow?
Well, there are certainly some people who have raised doubt about the number of infections. Certainly a week or 10 days ago, when the number was quite low, people were saying, how can it possibly be that low? Russia pointed out, the authorities pointed out that the border with China, the land border, was closed very quickly after the COVID-19 outbreak began in China. But there were still flights going between Beijing and Moscow right up until last week. So it is very surprising that there have been so few cases. In fact, most of the reported cases initially in Moscow had been returnees from Italy, people who had been on holiday in Italy, where we've also seen a very severe outbreak there. But also part of the problem may be the testing regime that Russia has in place. They had not been testing as widely as some other countries, although they do say the numbers are now very high. But there was also a two-step verification process whereby all positive tests then had to be sent to Siberia, to the centralized national testing place to be tested for a second time, to be verified there. That's no longer the case. Now, first positives are being considered confirmed coronavirus cases, and that's how we've seen the numbers going up in the last couple of weeks.
Absolutely, and considering the fact that most of the COVID-19 infections in Russia have been reported in the city of Moscow, is the lockdown that has now been put in place, is it restricted to certain regions, or does it apply across Russia? So far, it's only applicable to Moscow and the Moscow region, and that was brought in by the mayor of Moscow, not even the national government. But today we've been hearing from Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, who has called on other regions of Russia to implement similar restrictions. The northern region of Murmansk has also said it will implement another strict regime like Moscow. But it's very interesting that the government has not imposed these restrictions nationwide. They say that Moscow is the biggest problem. They want to prevent the spread within Moscow. However, the Moscow mayor announced yesterday that there would not be any restrictions on people coming and going from Moscow. People can still leave and come into the city. The restrictions are meant to stop people moving around, so stop people from going to work unless they absolutely have to, although it hasn't been made clear which jobs are considered necessary for people to still continue travelling. So public transport has not been shut down, and there will also be people travelling around the city, although the streets are certainly quieter today than we've seen in recent weeks. Absolutely indeed. And just before I let you go, Julia, if you could also weigh in on the public vote that was to take place on the 22nd of April, that would have allowed Vladimir Putin to continue staying on in office for a much longer period of time. What is likely to happen to this public vote? Has it been rescheduled at this point of time? Well, last week in his first televised address to the country, President Vladimir Putin announced that vote would have to be put on hold, but he did not suggest an alternative date. He said it would be up to healthcare specialists to determine when it would be safe to hold that referendum. Again, as you mentioned, one of the amendments that's being voted on in this constitutional referendum would be a provision to reset his presidential terms from 0. So that would allow him to run for another 2 presidential elections and possibly a further 12 years. So the government was very keen to not delay that vote. And now, of course, it has been forced to do so. There's no feasible way for that vote to carry on April 22nd as planned. It's likely to happen later in the year if Russia manages to get its coronavirus cases under control. But there are certainly concerns in the government that there could be some problems, that the result may not be quite as foregone conclusion as they may have thought.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Julia Chapman, for joining us from Moscow and getting us all those updates.